Hi, my name is Judith Carmichael. I'm 66 years old, and this is my story. I've lived in Charleston, South Carolina my entire life. I've seen hurricanes come and go, watched the old oaks grow and twist along the Battery, and raised my only daughter in a small yellow house with creaky floors and shutters that sang every time the wind rolled through. Life hasn't always been easy, but I'm not one to complain. I've worked, loved, and lost like most people my age. But nothing, not grief, not illness, not even poverty, could have prepared me for what my own family did to me. See, I never had much. I worked as a public school teacher for nearly 30 years, and when I retired, I had a modest pension and a few savings, mostly squirreled away for rainy days and small indulgences like Sunday dinners out or the occasional trip to Savannah. My husband, James, passed away a decade ago. We were married for 40 years, and after he was gone, the house felt different. Quieter, of course, but also emptier, like it forgot how to breathe without him in it. My daughter, Clara, visited often at first. She helped me with groceries, called every other day, brought her husband around sometimes. His name was Gregory, Greg for short. Greg never liked me much. I could tell from the first time we met. He had that polite smile that didn't reach his eyes and a handshake like a dead fish. He came from money, or at least he liked to think so, and he made it very clear that he thought Clara could have done better than a retired schoolteacher's daughter. But Clara loved him, and that was enough for me to bite my tongue, even when I wanted to tell her to run in the other direction. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to follow how I turned my pain into power and proved that it's never too late to reclaim your worth. Over time, their visits became less frequent. The phone calls, too. I'd leave messages that went unanswered. Holidays came and went with fewer invitations. Then one day, Clara told me she and Greg were moving to a new home across town. Something larger, fancier, in one of those gated communities where the lawns all look the same and nobody waves from their porch. I helped them pack, even boxed up their wedding china and carried it to the moving van myself. Clara promised I'd be over all the time, that they'd set up a guest room just for me. "With your favorite books and a window facing the garden," she said. I smiled and nodded. I wanted to believe her, but months passed, and I hadn't even seen the inside of the new house. I asked once, just once, if I could stay the weekend, since my roof had sprung a leak after a storm. I thought it'd be a nice excuse to spend time together while the repairs were being done. Clara hesitated. Greg, standing behind her, folded his arms. "There's no room," he said, sharp like the edge of a knife. This house wasn't built to accommodate guests. No room, not for his wife's mother, not for the woman who had given up vacations and late nights and entire decades to raise their child, not for the woman who had never asked them for anything until that very moment. I remember the heat rising in my cheeks, the way my chest ached like someone had knocked the wind out of me. Clara looked down. She didn't say a word. "I understand," I said softly. "I'll figure something out." And I did. I spent 2 nights sleeping on a neighbor's couch, listening to the drip, drip, drip of my own roof failing back home. But something changed in me that day. I wasn't just hurt. I was furious. Greg had humiliated me in front of my own daughter, dismissed me like some stray dog at the door. And Clara, oh God, Clara had let him. That was the worst part. After that, I stopped calling. I stopped waiting for them to include me. I started living on my own terms again, slowly reclaiming the parts of me that had dimmed after James passed. I went back to the library every Wednesday. I joined a knitting circle with a group of hilarious older women who had no patience for gossip, but plenty for red wine and homemade cake. I volunteered at the church food pantry, but every time I walked past their neighborhood, every time I saw their perfectly trimmed hedges and wrought iron gates, a fire burned in my gut. One day, while running errands downtown, I passed by a charming old brick building on Queen Street that I'd always admired. It was weathered, with ivy curling up its sides and windows that reflected the Charleston sun in golden streaks. The "for sale" sign in the window made me stop in my tracks. I stared at it for a long time. Then, as if pulled by a force I didn't fully understand, I stepped inside. It was a historic property, 3 stories, with creaky floors and worn banisters, but solid bones. It used to be a small inn, then a law office, then a boutique that had gone out of business. The realtor told me it needed work, but it was priced to sell. I walked from room to room, feeling the weight of every memory the walls seemed to hold. And in the back, past a narrow hallway and a squeaky door, was a sunlit room with a perfect view of the magnolia trees. That could have been my room, the one Greg said didn't exist. I made an offer that same week. It wasn't easy. I had to liquidate some of my retirement savings, pulled strings with old acquaintances from the school board, and even convinced a local investor friend to go in on the deal with me for rental income potential. But I did it. Within 2 months, the building was mine. And do you know the sweetest part? Greg's company, his little tech startup that he boasted about every Thanksgiving, had just moved offices downtown. They were looking for new space. And guess who owned the very building his company had just signed a letter of intent to rent? Me. Of course. He didn't know that at first. Everything was handled through agents and firms. But the day I walked into the building for a routine inspection and saw his face, eyes wide, mouth half open like he'd seen a ghost, it was like tasting revenge for the first time. "Judith?" he stammered, as if my name had become foreign in his mouth. "Greg," I said calmly, adjusting the pearl earring I wore only for special occasions. "I believe this office belongs to me now." That wasn't the end, of course. Far from it. But that day marked the beginning of something different. Something powerful. Something that no one, not even a smug son-in-law with a god complex, could ever take from me again. Owning that building gave me a kind of quiet thrill I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about the money. It was about control, about dignity, about taking back something that had been quietly chipped away for far too long. But I didn't buy the building just to spite Greg. At least, not entirely. It was bigger than that. For the first time since James died, I felt like I was moving with purpose. Like I wasn't just surviving. I was building something again. Something mine. But of course, Greg couldn't leave things alone. A few days after our awkward encounter in the hallway, he requested a formal meeting to discuss the lease situation. He brought along some junior lawyer in a shiny suit and acted like I hadn't been pouring him coffee in my kitchen 5 years ago. I wore my best blazer and brought my friend Marlene, a retired real estate agent who knew more about commercial law than any of those boys in ties. "Judith," Greg said, faking a grin, "we'd like to revisit the terms of the lease. I believe there may have been some miscommunication." "No miscommunication," I said, sipping my tea. "Your company signed a letter of intent for the space. The rate is fair, the terms are clean, and the building passed inspection." "I understand. But surely you realize this arrangement puts both of us in an awkward position." "Oh, Greg," I smiled. "I stopped worrying about being in awkward positions the day you told me I wasn't worth a room." His lawyer shifted in his seat. Marlene coughed, loudly, into her hand, hiding a grin. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. There's something powerful about a woman who knows her worth and finally has the paperwork to prove it. That meeting ended with Greg signing the lease, though he clearly hated every second of it. For a while, I let things settle. I didn't go out of my way to make life difficult for him, but I didn't go out of my way to make it easy either. My friend Tom, who ran a small cleaning company, got the contract for janitorial services. My niece's son, a college senior in need of an internship, handled the building's social media and promotions. Slowly, I turned that building into a little ecosystem of people I trusted, people who valued loyalty, kindness, and hard work. Everything Greg wasn't. Meanwhile, Clara kept her distance. At first, I thought she might reach out, maybe stop by, maybe apologize. But nothing came. Weeks turned into months. On my birthday, she sent flowers with a generic card signed, "Love, Clara and Greg." No phone call, no visit. Just lilies I was probably allergic to. It stung. Not because I wanted her approval. I was far past that. But because I had once believed we were close. I raised her to be better, to be brave. But somewhere along the way, she had chosen comfort over character. Or maybe she was just scared. Greg had a way of draining the air from a room and filling it with his opinions. I'd seen it happen. Clara, once so strong-willed as a girl, had slowly become a shadow when he was around. One afternoon, as I was reviewing some maintenance reports in the office, I overheard Greg yelling in the hallway. His voice was sharp, clipped, slicing through the plaster walls like a blade. "This is unacceptable," he barked. "I told you to reroute that invoice through the finance team, not process it directly. Are you even listening?" The girl he was shouting at, Jessica the receptionist, looked barely 20. Her hands trembled as she tried to explain herself. I stepped into the hallway before I even realized what I was doing. "Is there a problem here?" I asked. Greg turned, his face already red. "This is a company matter, Judith. I'll handle it." "No," I said calmly. "You're handling it in my building, with my employee, and you're not going to speak to her like that again. She made a mistake. She's also a human being." Jessica's eyes welled up with tears. Greg stood there, fists clenched. He didn't say another word. He walked back into his office and slammed the door. That evening, I sat on the old balcony overlooking the street and thought about everything that had changed. Not just in the past year, but in the past 20. I thought about the way I'd tiptoed around Greg, how I'd silenced my own instincts to keep peace for Clara's sake. And I thought about how many other women I knew who had done the same thing for sons-in-law, bosses, husbands. We shrink ourselves sometimes, to fit, to please, to not be a burden, and then one day we wake up and realize we've become invisible. But I wasn't invisible anymore. Not in that building, not in my life. The next morning, I made some changes. I upgraded Jessica's position and gave her a raise. I created a policy that all tenants had to abide by a code of conduct that included respectful communication with building staff. Greg didn't like it. He sent a terse email. I replied with a scanned copy of the new clause in their lease and reminded him that violation of it could lead to early termination. Around that time, I started seeing Clara again, briefly. She showed up one Saturday, knocking on my door like a stranger. She looked tired, thinner than usual. Her eyes darted behind me, half expecting Greg to be waiting on the couch. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded. She came in, sat on the same couch where she used to curl up with picture books and hot cocoa. We made small talk at first. The weather, my roses, her work. Then finally she looked at me and said the words I hadn't even realized I was waiting to hear. "I'm sorry, Mom." I didn't say anything. I just let the silence stretch, heavy and honest. "I should have stood up for you. That day, at the house. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared of what it would mean, of what Greg would say if I pushed back." "You don't have to explain," I whispered, though part of me wanted to hear every single explanation. "I do," she insisted. "You were right, about him. He's not a good man, and I'm starting to wonder if I even know who I am anymore." I reached across and took her hand. It felt small in mine, like when she was a child again, reaching up in the dark. "You're still in there," I said. "You just need to stop shrinking." She stayed for dinner. We laughed. We remembered James and watched reruns of a sitcom we both loved. But when she left that night, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. There was more to come, and deep down, I could feel it building, like the calm before a storm. Because men like Greg, men who thrive on control and ego, they don't just let go. They retaliate. And something in his eyes the last time I saw him told me he was planning something. The call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of low gray day that made Charleston feel heavy and slow. I was sipping tea in my office, reviewing a contractor's invoice, when Marlene burst through the door. Her hair frizzed from the damp, and her expression twisted in a way that made my stomach clench before she even said a word. "Judith," she said, dropping her soaked umbrella against the doorframe. "You need to see this." She handed me a file folder with shaking hands. Inside were printed emails, copies, a paper trail. I recognized the logo from Greg's company on the header. I started reading, each word hitting like a slap across the face. He had been trying to quietly sell his company's lease to a different firm, without my consent. Worse, he'd been bad-mouthing me to potential buyers, painting me as a difficult and unstable landlord, someone who was emotionally erratic and unfit for long-term partnership. I read that sentence twice. Unfit. That word. I had taught 30 children a year for 3 decades. I had balanced ledgers, navigated bureaucracy, raised a daughter, buried a husband, and survived more storms than I could count. And now Greg Carmichael, a man who didn't know how to hang a picture straight without Clara's help, had the nerve to call me unfit? I kept flipping pages. There were emails between Greg and a local developer, someone who had shown interest in the building. Greg had offered to pressure me into selling, hinted that he could influence my fragile emotional state, and get me to sign paperwork she didn't understand. It was a plan, an attack dressed up in corporate language and smug entitlement. I sat there for a long time, the rain tapping steadily against the windows, like it was counting down to something. Then I folded the papers, stood up, and took a breath so deep it hurt. "Call that lawyer friend of yours," I told Marlene. "Tell him we're going to war." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing Greg's voice echo in my head, reading and rereading every line of those emails in my memory. I wasn't just angry. I was betrayed. Again. He had tried to cut me out of my own life. Again. He had underestimated me. Again. But he wasn't going to get away with it. Not this time. The next day, I filed an official complaint for breach of lease and contract fraud. I involved a commercial litigation lawyer who specialized in landlord-tenant disputes. Greg's attempts to offload the lease were not only unethical, they were illegal, and I had every email to prove it. I issued a formal cease and desist letter to both Greg and the firm he'd been negotiating with, and then I put together a public statement about my commitment to protecting small business spaces in downtown Charleston. I made it clear that I supported tenants who respected their agreements, and those who didn't would be dealt with accordingly. But this wasn't just about legal action. I needed to take control of the story. So I did something bold. I called a reporter. A young woman named Elise from the Post and Courier had interviewed me a year before for a piece on retired women re-entering the workforce through real estate investment. She remembered me. She listened as I laid out everything Greg had done. The disrespect, the lies, the manipulation. I didn't mention names, of course. I didn't have to. The truth carried weight on its own. When the story went live, it made more of a splash than I expected. It wasn't front-page news, but it spread online. Retired teacher turned landlord stands up to corporate bullying. People loved it. Comments poured in. Former students reached out. Strangers offered support. Other landlords shared similar stories. The momentum was building, and I rode that wave with dignity. Not vengeance. Not yet. That would come later. Greg, of course, was livid. He called me, left voicemail after voicemail, alternating between threats and pitiful attempts to smooth things over. I didn't return a single one. Instead, I documented every message and forwarded them to my lawyer. By the time he realized how badly he had cornered himself, it was too late. His company's reputation had taken a hit, and internal pressure from his investors was mounting. And Clara? She was watching it all unfold from the sidelines, torn between her loyalty to him and the truth she could no longer deny. One afternoon, Clara showed up at my building again. She looked pale, thinner than the last time, as if the stress had hollowed her out. "He's unraveling," she said, sitting across from me with a paper cup of lukewarm coffee in her hands. "You've backed him into a corner." "No, Clara," I said gently. "He backed himself into that corner. I'm just holding up the mirror." She stared into her cup. "I don't know what to do." "Yes, you do," I said, softer now. "You've always known. You just haven't wanted to face it. I married a man who thinks power matters more than people." "You did, but you're still your own person. You still have choices." She looked at me, eyes brimming. "Do you hate me?" That question pierced deeper than I expected. I reached across the table and took her hand. "No, Clara, I've never hated you, but I've mourned you. I've missed the girl who used to defend stray dogs and bring me wildflowers. I've missed the woman who laughed with me in the kitchen and stood up for what was right." "I miss her too," she whispered. In the days that followed, things accelerated. Greg's investors forced a vote. He was pushed out as CEO, quietly, efficiently. I heard it through mutual contacts and a terse press release that framed it as a strategic realignment. He disappeared from the building shortly after. No goodbye, no confrontation, just an empty office with a broken desk lamp and a half-eaten protein bar in the trash. When the movers came, I stood on the sidewalk and watched them load box after box into a rusted van. I didn't wave. I didn't flinch. I just watched it end. And just like that, he was gone. But it wasn't over. Not really. Because after the fall comes the reckoning, and I still had to face the damage he'd done. To my daughter, to my peace. to my sense of family. But now, I was stronger, sharper. I knew how to rebuild. I had done it once. I could do it again. A few weeks later, Clara came by once more. This time she brought a suitcase. "I left him," she said simply. I didn't ask for details. I just opened the door wider. We sat on the balcony that night, wrapped in old quilts, watching the sun dip below the trees. The wind carried the scent of jasmine and something sweeter. Freedom, maybe, or healing. "I want to start over," she said. "I want to learn who I am again." "You already are," I said. "You just need time." And for the first time in years, I saw something return to her face. Light, strength, maybe even hope. When Clara moved in, we didn't talk about Greg much. At least not at first. There were too many fresh wounds, too much shame hanging between the lines of every sentence. Instead, we focused on little things, relearning each other's rhythms, cooking together, watching old movies, laughing at things that hadn't seemed funny in years. It was like nursing a garden back to life after a drought. You couldn't force the flowers to bloom, but you could water them gently every day and hope. I gave her the sunroom. She filled it with her art supplies, paints she hadn't touched since college, and a sketch pad that had been buried in some box at the back of her closet. I'd wake up some mornings to find her sitting on the floor, light pouring through the windows, her fingers smudged with charcoal and her hair pulled into a messy bun like when she was 22. Sometimes she'd hum to herself without realizing it. And in those moments, I didn't see the woman Greg had tried to break. I saw my daughter again, whole, becoming. For me, something shifted too. That building I'd bought out of spite was becoming something more, something sacred, a symbol, maybe, of autonomy, of quiet power. I spent more time there than I had before, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I chatted with the tenants, helped a young baker open her first cafe in the front unit, and even held a small weekend market in the courtyard for local artists and craftsmen. The energy in the space changed. People smiled when they walked in. It felt alive. One afternoon, Jessica, the receptionist Greg had once berated in the hallway, came into my office with a tray of cupcakes she'd baked herself. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for standing up for me. Back then. No one ever has before." I looked at her, barely out of her teens, eyes bright with promise, and I felt something inside me soften and steel all at once. "You deserved to be protected," I said. "Never let anyone make you feel small for needing kindness." She nodded, and in that exchange, something passed between us. An unspoken vow that we would be the women we needed when we were younger, that we would hold the line, not just for ourselves, but for those coming behind us. Of course, it wasn't all smooth. Clara had bad days. Some mornings she didn't want to get out of bed. Other times, she'd flinch when her phone buzzed, as if expecting Greg's name to appear. She never spoke of what the final days were like, but she didn't have to. I saw it in her posture, in the way she sometimes apologized just for existing in a room. Trauma leaves fingerprints you can't always wash away. One night, I found her crying in the kitchen, crouched on the floor beside the sink. I didn't ask what triggered it. I just sat beside her and wrapped my arms around her shoulders. "I stayed with him for too long," she whispered. "I kept hoping he'd change." "We all wait longer than we should," I said gently, "because love tricks us into thinking survival is loyalty." I thought if I kept quiet, if I made things easier, he'd love me the way I needed. I kissed the top of her head. "Sometimes we confuse being needed with being cherished. But you were always worthy of more than just tolerance, Clara. You deserve joy." After that, she started therapy. I offered to pay, but she insisted on covering it herself. She said it was part of reclaiming her independence. I respected that. Every Thursday afternoon, she'd come home a little quieter, a little more introspective. But week by week, I saw her shoulders lift, her voice strengthen, her spirit rise. And I was healing too, in ways I hadn't realized I needed. Owning that building had given me back my voice, but rebuilding my relationship with Clara gave me back my heart. I stopped carrying my grief for James like a weight around my neck and started talking about him again with laughter instead of tears. We hung his old jazz records on the living room wall. Clara framed one of his favorite photographs and put it on the mantel. It felt like a home again, Not just a place to live, but a place to belong. In early spring, I decided to host a community event in the courtyard of the building. We called it Second Chances. The idea was simple: bring together local women entrepreneurs, artists, and survivors to share their stories and sell their work. Clara helped design the flyers. Jessica volunteered to organize the vendor list. The baker made a special line of pastries called Breakthrough Bites. The event drew more people than I expected. Families, students, old neighbors I hadn't seen in years. At the center of the courtyard, we set up a small stage where people could speak. Some told stories of abuse. Others spoke about recovery, motherhood, dreams deferred and reclaimed. One woman read poetry she'd written in rehab. Another played a song on the ukulele that made half the audience cry. When it was my turn, I stood before them, nervous, heart pounding. But I spoke anyway. I was told once that I wasn't worth a room, that there wasn't space for me. And for a long time, I believed that. I made myself smaller, quieter, hoping to be enough. But here's the thing. I was never the problem. I was just in the wrong room. The crowd clapped. Clara beamed at me from the front row. And when I couldn't find a space that honored me, I made one. I bought it, rebuilt it, filled it with people who believed in respect and kindness. And now, I invite others to do the same. Make your space. Claim your worth. Speak your truth. Afterward, people hugged me. Strangers thanked me. The woman with the poetry told me I had given her hope. It was one of the most powerful nights of my life. That night, as we cleaned up and packed away folding chairs, Clara pulled me aside. "You've changed people's lives, Mom." I smiled. "So have you. You just don't see it yet." She hugged me tight, and in that moment, I felt it again. That sense that even after everything, even after betrayal and loss, life still had more chapters to give. But there was still one thing left undone. Because as much as I had moved forward, as much as Clara had begun to heal, Greg hadn't truly faced the full consequences of his actions. He had slithered into the shadows, quiet and disgraced, but untouched. I didn't want revenge for the sake of pain. I wanted accountability, truth, closure. I wasn't sure what that would look like yet, but I knew this. He hadn't heard the last of me. The letter came in a plain white envelope with no return address. I found it tucked between a water bill and a grocery store flyer, almost like it had snuck its way into my life when I wasn't looking. At first, I didn't recognize the handwriting. It was too neat, too formal. But when I opened it and saw the signature at the bottom, my breath caught in my throat. Gregory Carmichael. The letter was 2 pages long. He wrote about how he had lost everything: his position, his investors, most of his savings, and blamed everyone but himself. He said I had orchestrated a personal vendetta against him, that I had embarrassed him publicly, and destroyed his future. He didn't apologize. Not once. The closest he came was a sentence halfway through. "I may have said things I shouldn't have during a time of stress." That was it. No acknowledgement of the manipulation, no recognition of the lies. Just the same entitled, blame-shifting tone he had always carried. But the last paragraph was what got me. It wasn't just self-pity, it was a warning. "I will not be erased," he wrote. "People like you don't get the last word." I read it 3 times. I folded it carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it inside a folder marked Legal Correspondence. And then I sat in the kitchen, gripping a cup of tea that had long gone cold, and stared out the window as my mind raced through the implications. He was planning something. I didn't know what. But I knew the man well enough to sense the bitterness hadn't burned out. It had simply gone underground. A week later, the city inspector showed up at my building unannounced. He said there'd been a complaint about fire safety violations, then another one came about zoning infractions, then parking, then signage. One by one, small but costly complaints began piling up. Most were baseless, easily resolved. But they took time, energy, and money. It was clear someone was targeting the building. I had no proof, but I didn't need it. I could see Greg's fingerprints all over it. This was how he fought. Not head-on, but through back channels, with bureaucracy as his weapon. Marlene helped me compile everything into a formal timeline. We met with my lawyer, presented the pattern of harassment, and began preparing a restraining order. But emotionally, the toll was starting to show. I hadn't felt this level of pressure since the days after James died, when bills were due and my hands shook just from opening the mail. Clara saw it too. She tried to shield me, to take on tasks, to reassure me that we could handle it. But I could see the worry in her eyes every time the phone rang or a strange car parked across the street. Then one night, someone broke into the building. Nothing was stolen, no windows shattered, no real damage done. But someone had jimmied the lock on the side entrance and walked through the halls, leaving muddy footprints and opening desk drawers as if searching for something. The police took a report, dusted for prints, asked if I had any enemies. I told them no, but we both knew that wasn't true. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark with James's old baseball bat across my lap and my phone beside me, half expecting something worse to come. The violation wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Greg wanted me rattled. He wanted me to feel exposed, afraid, like I'd overstepped my place in the world he thought he owned. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The next morning, I called a press conference. I stood on the steps of the building, surrounded by tenants, friends, community members, people who had come to respect what I had created. Clara stood beside me, strong and silent, her presence like a shield. Cameras clicked. Microphones extended. I read from a prepared statement, laying out the timeline of harassment, the break-in, the pattern of targeted complaints. I didn't name Greg. I didn't need to, but I spoke the truth, clearly and without fear. I am not afraid of bullies in expensive suits, I said, and I will not be silenced by those who think power means domination. This building represents something more than brick and mortar. It represents resilience. And I will protect it with everything I have. The speech went viral in a local way, shared on neighborhood forums, reposted by small business accounts, written up by the Post and Courier again. The public support was overwhelming. Flowers arrived at my door. Cards. Even a few handwritten letters from women I didn't know who told me they felt seen for the first time in years. But the real turning point came 2 days later, when Clara walked into my office with something in her hand. A USB drive. She placed it on the desk with a shaking hand. I found this in his old desk drawer, she said. I don't think he meant for anyone to find it. On the drive were files, emails, documents, audio recordings, proof that Greg had not only orchestrated the campaign of complaints against me, but had paid under-the-table bribes to a city clerk to prioritize them. There was even a voice memo where he mocked me, said he was teaching an old woman her place. Clara sat across from me, tears in her eyes. I didn't know it was this bad, she whispered. I picked up the drive, weighed it in my palm like it was heavier than it really was. This, I said, is enough to end this. For good. We turned everything over to the authorities. The city launched an internal investigation. The clerk was suspended. Greg was subpoenaed. And just like that, the facade he had so carefully built began to crumble. He tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was too strong. His name was smeared across every news outlet in town. His former investors distanced themselves. His career, already faltering, sank completely. The final confrontation happened in court. He was there for a preliminary hearing, facing charges of harassment, defamation, and bribery. I took the stand, calm and composed, and told the truth, not just about the building, not just about the letter or the break-in, but about the years of control, the manipulation, the slow erosion of dignity that came from being treated like I didn't matter. When I stepped down, I looked Greg in the eye. For the first time, he looked small, not angry, not smug, just empty. A man stripped of the illusion that had fueled his cruelty. Outside the courthouse, Clara and I stood in the sunlight. Reporters asked questions. People clapped as we walked by. But the real moment, the one that mattered, happened quietly between us. You did it, she said. You really did it. We did it. I corrected her. Together. And in that instant, I realized something that went deeper than victory. Revenge had never been the goal. The goal was truth, dignity, justice, and maybe, just maybe, freedom. Life after Greg's downfall didn't snap into peace like the flip of a switch. It settled slowly, like dust after a storm. There were still meetings with lawyers, a few lingering statements to the press, and follow-ups from the city about the clerk involved. But what changed, what really shifted, was the weight in my chest. It had been there for years, long before the building, long before Greg's insults or his schemes. It was the weight of not being seen, of having my worth questioned in silence, of smiling through bruises that weren't on my skin but lived in the corners of every sacrifice I had ever made for people who never truly looked at me. But now, that weight was lifting, and in its place, something else was blooming. It wasn't victory, it was restoration. I sat on the balcony one morning, the same one where I had once watched movers carry out Greg's boxes, and breathed in the scent of the city waking up. Charleston was never quiet. There was always something humming in the air. Seagulls overhead, cars in the distance, the clang of a gate somewhere. But that morning felt different. The noise wasn't chaos. It was life. Clara came out with 2 cups of coffee. She had started waking up early again, getting back into a rhythm of purpose. Her paintings were filling up the sunroom now. Some were abstract, bright with motion and raw emotion. Others were quiet landscapes, peaceful and introspective. I had one hanging in my office, a moody piece in deep blue and gray, with just a sliver of gold breaking through the center. She called it Survivor. "I got an email from a gallery in Asheville," she said as she handed me a cup. "They want to include me in a show next month. All women artists over 40. I smiled. "That's wonderful, honey. Are you going to do it?" She nodded, her eyes shining with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Confidence. "I think I'm ready." She sat beside me, and we drank our coffee in comfortable silence for a while. Then she turned to me and said, "You know, I thought leaving Greg would be the hardest thing I'd ever do, but it turns out staying with him all those years, that's what really broke me. It just happened so slowly. I didn't notice until I was gone." "You weren't broken," I said gently. "You were buried. And now you're rising." The building had become something more than a symbol. It was thriving. The courtyard market had become a monthly event, drawing locals and tourists alike. The cafe expanded to serve breakfast and lunch. The second floor was rented to a women's nonprofit that helped single mothers find job training and legal support. Every hallway, every office, felt like it pulsed with purpose, and people smiled when they came in. They knew it was more than real estate. It was a sanctuary built from fire. I started mentoring a group of retired women who were looking to reinvest their lives in something new. Some wanted to open shops, others to create art, teach classes, start little community projects they'd been dreaming of for years, but had been told they were too old to try. We met every Thursday in the back office over muffins and coffee, and I listened more than I spoke. That's the thing about getting older. You finally realize how valuable silence can be, especially when it makes space for someone else's voice to rise. One day, Jessica came to me with a proposal. She wanted to start her own virtual assistant business, working from home and offering administrative help to small business owners. She had saved up money, taken online courses, and written a business plan. "I learned so much working here," she said, eyes wide with excitement. "And watching you stand up for yourself, it made me believe I could do this." I read her plan, made a few notes, and the next week, I offered her a microloan from the building's fund to help her get started. 2 months later, she was up and running, and her first client was one of the shop owners on the first floor. I saw a version of myself in her, younger, braver in a way I hadn't been until later in life. It was like watching a seed grow that I hadn't even realized I planted. Clara moved into a small cottage down the road. She still came by every day, and some nights she'd sleep over when we lost track of time watching movies or talking into the early hours. But she needed her own space again, and I wanted her to have it. Watching her decorate it, paint the walls, hang her art, it felt like a baptism of sorts. A woman stepping into her own light. Greg, on the other hand, faded from the narrative. His legal issues escalated for a while, but eventually he cut a plea deal to avoid trial. He lost most of his professional contacts, and last I heard, he had moved to another state. There was no grand final confrontation, no dramatic last scene. He simply disappeared from our lives like a bad stain, finally scrubbed clean. And that was enough. I wrote a letter I never sent. I wrote it to him, detailing everything I had wanted to say the day he looked me in the eye and said I wasn't worth a room. I poured every ounce of pain and resolve into it, not for him to read, but for me to release. When I finished, I folded it, placed it in the fireplace, and watched it turn to ash. The smoke curled upward and vanished, taking with it the last piece of bitterness I had held onto. Sometimes revenge looks like fire. Other times, it looks like peace. On the anniversary of the building's reopening, we held a celebration. There was music in the courtyard, food from every tenant's culture, and candles lining the walkways. I gave a short speech, nothing grand, just words from the heart. This building taught me that it's never too late to reclaim your story, I told the crowd. We're not defined by how others treat us. We're defined by how we rise afterward. That night, Clara surprised me with a painting. It was a portrait of me, standing in front of the building, hands in my pockets, the sunlight hitting my silver hair like a halo. Behind me, the windows glowed golden. She called it The Woman Who Stayed Standing. I cried, openly, freely, and for the first time in a long time, those tears weren't from pain. They were from pride, from healing, from gratitude for every scar that had shaped me. I wasn't just the woman who had been underestimated. I was the woman who rose. A year passed, then another. Time, as it always does, carried on, steady and indifferent. But within the passing seasons, within the rhythm of ordinary days, life found its shape again. Not as it once was, but as something stronger, wiser, and infinitely more beautiful. Charleston continued to hum with its southern charm, its cobblestone streets soaking in the sunlight, and the scent of magnolia and salt always hanging in the breeze. And I, Judith Carmichael, at 68 years old, woke each morning not just with purpose, but with peace. The building stood proudly on Queen Street, restored fully now, with its bricks cleaned, windows polished, and energy humming through every corner like a heartbeat. The tenants were more than renters. They were a community. We'd created something lasting there, something sacred. Where once there had been silence and fear, now there was laughter echoing from open doors, warm greetings exchanged in the hallway, shared pots of coffee brewed in the shared lounge. And every time I stepped through those doors, I felt it. Home, not defined by walls, but by the people who moved within them. Clara's art had blossomed into something beyond either of our expectations. After the Asheville Gallery show, she was invited to speak on a panel about rediscovering creativity after emotional trauma. Her work began to carry a following, women especially, women who had lived quietly, who had folded themselves small to fit into someone else's version of love, gravitated toward her paintings like flowers reaching toward light. She didn't just make art. She made truth visible. She gave pain color and survival texture. She still lived in the little cottage down the road, surrounded by wildflowers and brushes, her cat Franklin always sunbathing on the porch. We had dinner together every Friday without fail. Sometimes it was takeout and a bottle of wine. Sometimes it was a full roast chicken with all the trimmings. Every meal felt like a celebration. Of us. Of how far we'd come. Of the bond that had frayed but never truly broken. There were still shadows, of course. Healing isn't a straight line. Some nights Clara would fall silent, and I knew she was remembering the darker years. Other times I'd catch myself reaching for James's coffee mug before remembering it wasn't mine to touch anymore. But we had learned to live with those shadows. We had learned to let them be a part of the landscape, not something to be banished, but something that reminded us of where we'd been and what we'd overcome. I kept the Thursday morning group going. The women who came each week had become a family of sorts. We laughed more than we cried now. One of them, Patricia, finally opened her bookstore cafe, Chapters and Chai, right next door to my building. Another, Lillian, started a podcast about life after 60. They called themselves the Silver Circle. I liked that. It sounded like something strong and precious and earned. Jessica's business had taken off too. She eventually moved into one of the office suites upstairs and now had 3 employees. I watched her grow from a timid assistant into a bold entrepreneur, and every time she knocked on my door with an update, I saw a glimpse of that trembling girl who once stood frozen in a hallway, terrified of Greg's wrath. She wasn't that girl anymore. She had become a storm in her own right, soft-spoken but unshakable. Sometimes I'd walk through the halls of the building just to feel it, to remind myself of what it meant. I'd run my fingers along the old banisters, listen to the sounds of printers and phone calls, and the distant clink of silverware from the cafe. I'd pause at the sunroom Clara once helped me clean when the building was still empty, when it still smelled like old wood and dust. That room was now a creative studio open to the public, where local artists could come and work, or just sit and be. The light poured in the same way, soft and golden, and every time I stepped into that space, it felt like stepping into a memory that had learned how to breathe again. Greg's name faded. There was no final headline, no Hollywood-style confrontation in a courtroom, just his silence, his absence. Last I heard, he had taken a consulting job in another state, but his reputation never fully recovered, and I didn't need it to. I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need revenge that looked like punishment. I had already won, because I had my voice. I had my dignity, and I had reclaimed every part of me he'd tried to erase. There's a particular joy in getting older that no one tells you about when you're young. It's not just about wisdom or perspective, it's about power. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to scream. The kind that shows up every day and chooses integrity, chooses grace, chooses not to disappear just because the world says your story is finished. My story wasn't finished. It had just begun again. People often ask me if I'd do it all the same, if I'd buy the building again, if I'd confront Greg again, if I'd open myself to the chaos and risk of starting over at 66. And my answer is always the same. Absolutely. Because for the first time in my life, I stopped asking for permission to exist in full color. I stopped waiting to be invited. I made my own seat at the table. And then I built the damn table myself. The last addition I made to the building was a small plaque near the front entrance. It wasn't flashy, just a rectangle of bronze with a simple inscription, "For every woman who was told she wasn't worth a room, this is yours." People stop and read it sometimes. I've seen them pause, touch the metal, linger with eyes full of recognition. Some smile, some tear up, some just nod, as if to say, "I understand." And that, more than anything, tells me I did the right thing. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and painted the sky in orange and lavender, Clara and I sat on the back steps of the building, watching people gather for another courtyard event. The lights were strung above like stars. Music floated from a speaker. Laughter rose like incense. "I never thought life could feel like this," Clara said softly. "Like what?" "Like I belong in it. Like it's mine." I reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "That's because it is." We sat there long after the sun had gone down, long after the guests had arrived and the music had filled the space with something electric and alive, and I thought of every step, every fight, every tear, every quiet victory. It had all led here, not to a building, not to a speech, but to a moment of stillness where I could look at my daughter, at our lives, and know without a shadow of a doubt that we were free. This was the ending I never knew I needed, and the beginning I never dared dream of. Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't deserve space, even from your own family? Share your experience in the comments below. If my story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and transformation. And if you know someone who's doubting their worth because of how they've been treated, send them this story. They might need the reminder, because sometimes what feels like an ending is just the start of the most empowering chapter of your life. Thank you for listening to my journey, and always remember, you are never too old to stand tall and reclaim your voice.